Hi, I'm Justin Colley. Welcome to From Ideas to Innovation, where we bring together the people who study the world and the people who build it to solve today's policy problems.
This is not Josh Bandoch talking. This is all the best neuroscience and psychology in the world. So here's how all of our brains, all 8 billion of us, are wired. We feel first, then
I'm excited to be joined by Josh Bandoch, who's a persuasion expert, TEDx speaker, and policy advocate. He's the author of How to Get What You Want, Mastering the Art and Science of Persuasion. He has spent over a decade uncovering the secrets of persuasion. He's mined psychology, neuroscience, economics, public policy, and history for cutting-edge techniques that work. He's put them to use in hundreds of speeches written for senior government officials, delivered to just about any audience. Josh uses and refines these techniques on a daily basis as a think tank leader, where he crafts and communicates policies on issues like poverty, social mobility, education, and the economy to politically diverse audiences. That includes elected officials, local and national media, and grassroots advocates. And I'm very excited for you to listen. Well, thanks for coming on, Josh.
Justin, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love Archbridge. You guys do great work. Really great. Excited to have a conversation with you. We worked together a lot in the past, so this is awesome. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Very excited to have you to talk about your book, How to Get What You Want, Mastering the Art and Science of Persuasion. So what I find very interesting about this book is that most of the books that written about similar topics would come from someone who's typically like a more professional psychologist. But instead, you're someone who spent their career working kind of in many different sectors, in academia, in government, as development officer, and a public policy advocate. Given those different career arcs, you bring a very interesting perspective, which really comes out in the book. So what gave you the inspiration to write the book in the first place?
So I think two things there, the inspiration and then kind of this like weird mix of things that I hope brings a really special product to the reader. So a big part of what motivated me to write the book is that I grew up in the world of ideas in academia, and then worked in the policy space and worked as a speechwriter and worked in fundraising. And I just saw so many really just capable, smart people stuck, not unleashing their potential, not because of what they had to say, but because of how they were saying it. In academia, that would just be an overly academic and sort of beat you over the head with their logic way. We might come back to that later.
We will.
And then, in the policy space or the sort of like government space, it's just like data reasoning yet again. And it's like, in fact, it was in fundraising that I learned a lot of what you had to do to get what you want. So it was this motivation that there are all these smart people out there, and if they could take a great what and package it with a how they talk about it, the sky is the limit for them. So that's really the sort of big overarching goal, is just to help people unleash their potential by teaching them how to say things, not what to say, but how to say it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then what would you say, is this book written for someone in particular, or do you think it could be applied kind of across different industries, different fields? And how do you see that as you were writing the book?
Yeah, like who's the audience for this thing? So the most specific audience is ambitious professionals who want to grow and know that how they say things is absolutely foundational to climbing on as high as they want to. And that's the primary audience. So kind of early mid-career professionals. Broadly speaking, though, like professionals in what fields? So a lot of fields. I mean, I work in the policy space, so that's one of the target audiences. Sales. Chapter 1 of the book is, I think, extremely important to sales, and it's about the right mindset you bring to every encounter with people. So sales / fundraising. I used to work in fundraising, and that's where I learned a lot of that stuff. And then, folks in journalism, lawyers, basically anybody who is interacting with a human being on a daily basis, this stuff's going to be helpful for them, but especially folks in those kinds of fields.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's what I got out of the book when reading it, that I could see exactly where different industries, where people from different industries or different backgrounds could really find use for it, which I think makes the book very approachable and very, have wide appeal in that way. So you
And I would add
acknowledge,
one layer to it,
yeah.
which is, there's the personal stuff too. Whether you're talking to your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, or you're negotiating with your spouse or your kids, or you're just dealing with a customer service agent. How you approach things matters tremendously. A couple weeks ago, I had to call Verizon because I was having like a little service issue, and these customer service agents get beat up all the time. So many of their calls are just somebody screaming at them because obviously it's the customer service agent's fault that their service is out or that they had this problem, right? Like not at all. It's totally stupid. And yet they beat them up. And so I know that. So I'm overly nice to them because they have a really hard job, really respectful and like thankful because I really appreciate what they're doing. And so twice in the span of 3 days, I had to call Verizon. On the first call, after 15 minutes of the lady being super helpful, me being super grateful, she said, "Hey, do you want me to see if you have any deals on your account?" And I was, saddled with an ancient iPhone 13 at the time, and she found a deal where I could get a brand new iPhone 17 at no charge, and I was like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah." When I had actually asked a few months ago if that was available to me, and the person said no. And then a couple days later, I had to call about something else. And again, same thing, 15 minutes, then super nice. And lady says at the end, "Hey, do you want me to check your account for any deals?" And I said, "Sure," thinking obviously like 2 days ago, the lady found any deals that were there. And then she said, "Hey, does your wife want a new phone?" And I'm like, "She sure does." So then my wife also got a new iPhone 17. I was nice to people and they went out of their way to help me. So I got what I wanted without even asking for it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things about this type of like negotiation or just approach to speaking to people, is that you can
Yeah.
ask the same question but a whole bunch of different ways, and it's really how
Oh,
you
yeah.
ask the question that matters the most. So what do you see as, in your book, the type of manners in which you can ask I guess if you had to give like a short pitch to someone, like how should you ask questions to get what you want?
So the first, and I imagine we'll dive into some of those things, is to really frame things for the other person, to put them first. Ask questions in a way that's going to resonate with them, not in a way that's going to necessarily resonate with you. And then ask especially about their feelings because we feel first, then reason. So ask them how they would feel about something, and it unlocks just these remarkable things. And then ask open-ended questions because when you ask people yes or no questions, they got nowhere to go. And if you ask them a what or a how question, then they're going to go where they want to go, and then you see where they go, and invariably there's going to be some overlap between where they go and where you want to go. That would be like the sort of really general way that I would think about asking good questions. Don't box people in, make it about them. Start with feelings.
Yeah, because I would imagine there's like a defense mechanism. Like if you box someone in, there's kind of that
Yeah,
primal instinct in you to kind of one feel threatened, and then either you have this kind of fight or flight mode or
totally.
response to that. So you either want to fight back and then you don't get what you want because then now you have this confrontation, or you're in this kind of flight mode where you just avoid the confrontation to begin with, as soon as you feel this
Absolutely.
sort of boxed in method. So yeah, I find that makes a lot of sense.
And I think one of the biggest ways we try to box people in is to corner them into or beg them to say yes. Please, please,
Hmm.
please, please just say yes. You're like, "Hey, I mean, don't you think this or don't you agree?" And if they agree, they'll just tell you. And I mean, do you like people cornering you into agreeing with them?
No, I personally don't.
No, right? So it's like instead, you can either just ask an open-ended question instead of you say, "Don't you think that's a good idea?" So look, in our policy space, "Hey, don't you agree with this policy idea?" You just ask them the open-ended feeling question, "How do you feel about this idea?" And then they give you a remarkably honest and unguarded answer as opposed to, "I mean, don't you agree?" which the implication is always, well, if you don't agree, you're wrong and probably not that smart. So, dummy, do you agree? It's like, I mean, is
It's always very persuasive calling somebody a dummy. Yeah.
that's
Yeah, I don't appreciate being called a dummy, even when I am being dumb, and I can't imagine, that sort of method would work too well.
I just meant like implicit, like we don't necessarily say dummy, but it's like the way we frame things, like, don't you think that? It's like, well, I mean, obviously, don't you think that? I was in an Uber on Saturday, and the guy was, telling me how, because I mentioned the book, and he's telling me how, he was just like presenting his daughter with this like hyper rational case, and like obviously what she said was just so dead wrong, but she just wouldn't open her eyes. And I'm like, yeah, that's going to work. I mean, does it work on you? No, but yet it's going to work on his daughter. Good luck. Good luck.
Fair enough. Yeah. So that leads me to another question, because you acknowledge in the book that there's situations where persuasion isn't possible. Right? There's sometimes you just come to a head and there's not going to be an agreement, and there's not if you're in a negotiation, like, you're just going to have to leave the deal, or you're not going to be able to get this policy you're
Yeah.
pushing for passed. So for policy advocates, or salespeople, or really anybody who kind of spends their time or their career trying to move somebody but failed, how do you know when to walk away versus keep trying? Like, how do you know when your method of persuasion just isn't working and you just have to move on?
That's a great question. And part of persuasion is knowing when you can't get what you want from somebody in that moment. Because if you're just like beating a dead horse, you're just wasting your time. So that is part of persuasion, is knowing when to stop. I think the most important thing you can do is to identify barriers, and then try to remove them. So we think that persuasion is about getting somebody to do something. And over the decade plus that I've been working on this book and really just thinking about and practicing and researching, I've come to understand that persuasion is much more about understanding why somebody isn't already doing something and what's stopping them from doing that, and then seeing if you can help them remove that barrier. So if you're on the policy space or the sales space, I mean, or anything, right, with your spouse, an extremely powerful question is just to ask somebody, what would stop you from doing X? If you're lobbying a lawmaker, senator, what would stop you from supporting this bill? You're in sales. What would stop you from buying from us for the first time? Or what would stop you from increasing your orders with us? You're negotiating with your boss. What would stop you from giving me a promotion? What would stop you from giving me a raise? And then when you identify that, and when you ask this way, they stop and think, well, why isn't that already happening? And what is stopping it? And then once you know that barrier, you can see if you can remove it or not. In some cases, you can't. So if your boss says, look, the only reason I can't give you a raise is because the budget's tight. We're a small organization. And if I had the money, I would totally give it to you. You're worth it. And I know that you're underpaid. So if Q4 is good this year, yeah, we actually could be in a really good position to give you a raise. Or if they say, look, I mean, just your performance is fine, but there are a lot of things you got to work on. Okay, well, then you go, what are they? Is he telling you, look, as long as you improve, you'll get a raise? Or is he kind of telling you, you kind of reached the ceiling here? So that question unlocks so much, and then you have to decide how to proceed. So if the policy person asks the elected official what would stop you, and they say, look, I just need to see the data. Okay, cool. Show them the data. If they say, I just I don't know, politically, I don't know if it's viable. Maybe you're showing them survey data instead that like the policy is really popular. So what can you do to remove that barrier? And when you do that, then boom, things can happen. And if you don't remove it, there's always going to be something important stopping them from doing something.
No, that makes a lot of sense, because again, you're asking the same question as you would if you just directly asked, "Can I have a raise?" or "You should buy from us," or "You should choose this. You should vote for this policy." But you're unlocking a lot of information that they were either didn't give in the first place, or they were hesitant to give in the first place. Yeah. And by asking those questions in such a way, you're sort of guiding them to give you the response and the reason so that you know how to respond. Because to a question, can I have a promotion or a raise? The answer no could mean there could be 25 different reasons why that is a no.
Exactly.
But it's very important for you to know what that reason is, because that needs to know, do you need to increase your performance? Do you need to improve? Is it a thing on their end that, like you said, like the budget's just tight, or, if you're, buying something from somebody, like, oh, I'll just get a better price from somebody else and, money's tight, so we just have to go with this product instead. It really unlocks a lot of information despite asking the same fundamental question you were asking in the first place. So that leads me to wonder about how you define persuasion as the sort of shared action rather than winning or convincing. Because I think, obviously, who doesn't love winning, right? People love to win, succeed. It's very fun, right? It's great to win. If you're playing like a board game with somebody, obviously you prefer to be the winner than the loser in most situations. But for someone whose identity is building around winning a legislative fight or winning a new client or increasing the sales from a client, what changes in their actual practice when they adopt that definition? Like what is what would you see as like the fundamental thing that they've changed about themselves or their approach if they're following the methods in your book?
Great question. And if it's okay, I'll kind of rewind just for a second to give the listeners a little sense of how I think about this, and then answer your question. Before I can just clarify what I think persuasion is, I think it's helpful to understand what persuasion isn't. So there are, I think, three common misconceptions of persuasion. The first is that it's about winning, which you already alluded to. And Justin, if I win against you, what does that make you?
Loser.
Loser! Do you want to work with somebody who makes you feel like a loser?
Probably not, no.
No, my God, it's terrible. So persuasion can't be about winning. And some people think that it's about convincing someone to think like them. And the Latin root of the word convince actually means to vanquish or to conquer. Conquest is barbaric, it's not persuasive. So it's not about convincing someone to think just like you. And incidentally, there's only one person who thinks just like you, and that's you. And I don't even agree with everything that I did yesterday. So I don't even think like me all the time because we're humans and we make mistakes. So I don't know. And the third is that persuasion, as I think, especially prominent in the intellectual, academic, policy space, that persuasion is just this battle of like logic and reason and data. And the trouble is that our brains are wired to feel first and reason. So when you launch your logic at somebody, that's actually illogical because it's not in accordance with how our brains are wired. So what is persuasion instead? I think that persuasion is shared action. It's shared because it's something that we voluntarily do with others, and it's action because it's about getting things done. So like winning, we think winning, well, I'm just going to win this particular battle. You're not trying to win a battle. You're trying to win a war with somebody else. And it's not even winning a war exactly. It's repeatedly working with somebody. Because typically when you have the winner's mindset, you might get what you want in the individual transaction. And then the person doesn't feel so great about that transaction because they felt like, it was okay, but they didn't really get enough out of it. And then they're going to be less inclined to work with you again. If you think of persuasion as shared action, and it's something that is you're playing the long game, not the short game. You're trying to win repeatedly with somebody. That's a totally different approach because then you're trying to build authentic relationships. You're trying to build trust because you want to go back to that person. You want that person to go and say, I bought from Justin and it was phenomenal. Customer service was out of this world. The product was great. You got to try this too. Or, in your actual, job in the sort of policy space, like Justin was a delight to work with. Like everyone should work with Justin. Or, oh my God, this research is amazing. You've got to check this out, right? This social mobility stuff is awesome and it's super important. Like share this far and wide. So you're trying to win repeatedly because you're going to publish your social mobility report again in 2 years. You're writing stuff all the time. And if you have a good reputation and people trust you and you're authentic, you're going to quote unquote win so much more often.
Yeah. There's not to get too academic, but it's kind of like a repeated game in game theory versus a one-time shot. Like you said, like in a one-time, kind of shot.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, like you can beat someone into submission to just say yes, or I agree, or I take this deal. But given the time, and that leads you to winning in the short run. But given the time that the person then has to reflect and think about it the next time they need something or want to go back to the same sort of approach, they're probably going to not want to work with that person anymore. They're going to say like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, sure, like they did find work or, they provided the products, but they weren't pleasant to be around. And I think at the end of the day, people like feeling pleasant, and they like, they prefer people that are easy to work with and more, easy to get along with than people who are just a constant adversarial relationship time and time again. So I think that is a great point. And I thought you, right at the end, you mentioned something about that we're wired to feel first and then reason second, which what I would assume that often means for someone in policy, for example, that leading with like data. Hey, look at this chart. Doesn't this, line goes up? Doesn't that show this is good? That could be sometimes, according to this approach, counterproductive. And I would say, at least when I read the book, for me, it was a hard pill to swallow for sure. And I'm assuming, I won't be the only one who feels that way when reading it. So how do you convince, or what methods, or how do you convince researchers or policy wonks to put emotions ahead of their findings without feeling like they're compromising their rigor or their analysis?
I laugh because, I hate so much what I'm about to explain in greater depth. I've alluded to it, I think, twice already. I hate it. It stinks because as a former academic, who was raised in the peer review process, it goes against everything that I was taught. As somebody who works at a think tank, who's paid to quote unquote think, it goes against everything. And fine. So here goes. This is not Josh Bandoch talking. This is all the best neuroscience and psychology in the world. It's people like Danny Kahneman talking, people like Antonio Damasio, Jonathan Haidt. This is these people talking. So here's how all of our brains, all 8 billion of us, are wired. We feel first, then reason. Sometimes it's feel and reason. Sometimes it's feel then reason. Sometimes it's feel, and we never get the reasoning. I've been there. You probably have too, Justin. I had definitely been there.
Yeah.
So that means that you have to start with feelings, not with logic. And here's part of the fun, is that people who suffer brain damage and their ability to emote is impaired, they're actually not able to reason. So emotions actually enhance our reasoning. What all this means is that the logic first approach to persuasion is actually, wait for it, illogical. It's illogical because it is not in accordance with our cognitive wiring. And is it logical to ignore our cognitive wiring? Is it logical to ignore all the neuroscience and all the psychology? I don't think so.
Probably
I don't
not.
think so.
Yeah.
So how do I explain this to intellectual folks? By showing them that their approach is illogical and relying on neuroscience and psychology. So it is a super tough pill to swallow. What it does mean is that, look, data and logic, all stuff, it's important. We do reason. It's just that comes second in the process, which means that how you frame things matters tremendously. It matters tremendously. And you have to be extremely attentive to somebody's emotions. And our emotions, incidentally, are grounded in reason. So when you feel negative or positive for something, there's a reason for that. You're like, oh my God, that's amazing. It's just like this, ebullient response burst out of you. There's a reason why you feel so good. Or when you're like, ugh, and you're so frustrated or just upset or whatever, there's a reason for that. It's just that our intuitions, our emotions, they're lightning fast, which is actually really cool because in a way it's our reasoning in like hyperspeed. Just boom, there's a quick response. And you're like, there was a reason for that. And like, I get it. And like, that made sense at some level. It doesn't mean that only emoting in the rawest manner is good. Please let me be clear about that. It is, though, the reality that we feel first. So you have to be mindful of what are the feelings that you want to generate and how do you do that, which we can dive into if you'd like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's do it. So yeah, so on that point, because when I think about the whole kind of emotions first or feeling first, and then you get to reason, and like you said, it kind of varies depending on how well linked. I guess I'm not a psychologist, so I'm going to try to use the words as this might not be exact, but how close or how closely wired those two emotions or feelings, and then reasoning, how how well they connect or how quickly they connect. Would you say this is kind of similar to like a preconceived bias? So like in my perspective, right? So I'm vast majority of the time, I am a free market economist. Like I believe that markets do a much better job at pretty much everything than government action. So obviously that is a preconceived bias that I have when going to approach. It's a principle, but it's also a bias that I have when going into solving some solution. Would you say that those things are pretty similar, or they're slightly different? Like, is that kind of what you mean?
Well, so one thing that I do in the chapter in the book, chapter 3, Start with Feelings, is also try to chip away at the notion that we're like some of us are actually purely logical. So we have over 100 and I think 90 at this point they've discovered cognitive biases. And then we bring our own biases to situations as well. So, you being a free market person, me too, talking to a socialist, we're going to bring different biases to things. And that is going to color how you see things too. And that's going to cover both how you feel and think about things. And part of it is just being mindful of those realities. So, like, if someone were to talk to you, as a socialist and they just beat you over the head with their socialist logic, that's probably not going to be that effective. In the same way that if you beat them over the head with your free market logic, that's not going to move them to do anything. I have this kind of metaphor in the book of a logic tsunami. Like, is that how somebody cleanses you of your, bad and mistaken thoughts by just like launching their logic tsunami at you? Like, has that ever worked on you, Justin? Ever?
No. No,
Okay,
just all right.
so
Here's
right,
100 pages of why I'm right. It's on to you to read it and figure it out. Yeah, that's. I mean,
and
it's approach. I mean, it's not approachable in that sense. Like it's going to be hard to move people in that way.
yeah, I mean, so look, when I say navigate cognitive realities, you're still trying to navigate them to get what you want. So you first have to observe them and then learn how to navigate them. So it does not mean that you cannot sell a free market policy to a socialist. It just means that how you approach it is different than if you were talking to a fellow free marketeer. It's a different enterprise and it can be done. It's just you have to be mindful of that. So we can explain how to do things like that, but it can be done. It's just that you have to be really mindful of your audience and make it about them and not just assume that everybody thinks like you. Because again, only one person thinks just like you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's not more people who think just like me. So I want to stick
Right?
with.
Sadly, right?
So I want to stick with the. I believe this was in chapter 3, but the distinction between being right and actually making a difference. For the audience, could you clarify what do you see as the differences there, and is there this? Because I think if someone first heard it without reading the book, right? If someone's listening to this before reading the book and buying the book, which I highly recommend doing, they would say like, "Oh, well, that's a trade-off of my principles or what I believe." Is that really the case, or and what and to what extent do we actually go there?
I think each and every day we're faced with a decision in almost every interaction, really. Do I want to be right or do I want to make a difference? Being right is really easy. You just, launch your logic at somebody, you lay it out for the world to see on Twitter, X, whatever, Facebook, Instagram, I guess even on LinkedIn these days, not as much so, right? On a blog post, an op ed, in the media, whatever. And you just announce to the world how right you are and how wrong somebody else is. And it even feels really good. And the goal is only to display how brilliant and how correct you think you are. It's not to accomplish anything because only people who think just like you will say, yeah. And anybody who doesn't will just roll their eyes and ignore you. Making a difference is much harder and it's much more gratifying. Making a difference is truly accomplishing things. It's sharing action. It's actually getting what you want as opposed to just saying, well, I think this. And if you don't disagree, if you don't agree with me, you're some combination of crazy, stupid, and evil. So making a difference requires a lot of intentionality and it's satisfying not just once, but time and time and time again because you form a relationship with somebody and then you work together, you grow that relationship, you accomplish things, rinse and repeat, and it grows.
Yeah, so I'm curious because you work with Illinois policymakers, and so obviously coming from a more free market approach on your end, to Illinois, which I would not say typically has politicians who are more free market oriented. Did you have this kind of thinking before this approach, or what did this thinking teach you when you actually went to go, work with these policymakers in Illinois?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll zoom out for a second. Okay, start with feelings. Fine. Skeptical, but maybe. Well, then it begs the question, what kinds of feelings are persuasive, and how do you generate those feelings? So you go to Fox News, MSNBC, whatever, and the answer is super obvious. What kinds of feelings are persuasive? Negative feelings. Obviously, when I was writing the introduction to that chapter, I went to the websites of those two news organizations, and I found literally one story that was positive on like 200 stories total on both homepages. That's wild. We're also wired with something that is called negativity bias. We focus on, we're attuned to, we're much more mindful of negative information. It's a threat sensor, which it makes sense. The problem is that being negative impedes our ability to thrive, even though it helps us survive. Like, I'll kick it over to you, Justin. When you think of some of the most persuasive Americans, or not, just people of the last 100 years, who comes to mind?
That's a great question.
Intuitively, you have some like quick answers.
I mean, intuitively, I do think the President of the United States, which is someone who I pretty much disagree with on many things.
Are there two or three other people that come to mind the last 100 years that you're like, oh, okay, they were also they were persuasive?
I guess I automatically thinking of politicians. I'm thinking of people who I feel like were really good at kind of getting people to work with them. So I think of like people like Bill Clinton, for example, who did a pretty good job of working across the aisle and having people on both the left and the right work with him. And same with I guess John McCain was also someone who was also tended to have a persona that people were attracted to, liked, and wanted to work with.
So if we just maybe look 65 years back, JFK, positive. So I mean, the answer that I guess I'm trying to point towards is positive emotions. And how do we know that? Because look at some of the folks that were the most persuasive. JFK, he said, "Ask not." Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. Ronald Reagan saw America as a shining city. Bill Clinton, he felt people's pain. Empathy right there. Empathy, empathy, empathy. Barack Obama was all about hope and change. And even Donald Trump, just to make this really more observational, I don't want to get too political here. His what do the hats say? Those red hats. Make America great again. He's for something, right? He's for making America great again. Now, does he deploy negativity? Totally. Do I think negativity deployed by him or anybody else? Just to be clear, anybody else? Is that something that I would recommend? Well, I would really recommend positivity. Fine. And people, when they say who are the most persuasive people, they say JFK, they don't say Walter Mondale. They say Martin Luther King Jr., they don't say Malcolm X. They say Ronald Reagan, they don't say Barry Goldwater. They say Barack Obama, they don't say Joe Biden. So it's like those comparisons help us understand, wow, okay, and all these people were happy warriors. So, okay, part of it is being a happy warrior and being for things. So like in the opportunity space where you and I both work, what am I for? I'm for things like opportunity and freedom and dignity through work and strong communities and strong families and independence and freedom and things like that. Those are beautiful things to be for. And then, okay, well, that's all well and good when you're working with people who really are wired to think differently. So you're a free marketeer talking to progressives. Well, you also have to be mindful of their values and frame things in terms of their values. So basically, morality works like this. Right? For those who are in video, I'm just taking out my tongue, and that's roughly how it works. So just like we have 5, maybe 6 actual physical taste receptors on our tongue, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, and possibly oligustus or fat, we are wired to have 6, maybe 7 moral tastes. They are care, so like sensitivity to suffering and caring for others, equality or equity, equal outcomes, proportionality, which is about merit and hard work and what you deserve, loyalty, in-group, out-group, authority, essentially how sensitive you are to hierarchies, purity, kind of like sanctity versus like degradation, and then liberty, basically being free to live as you see fit. And people of different political persuasions tend on average to be sensitive to different moral tastes. So folks on the left are more sensitive to care and harm and a certain kind of liberty called positive liberty. Conservatives are sensitive to proportionality, loyalty, authority, purity, and a sort of negative kind of liberty being freedom from restrictions. Libertarians have an even narrower palette, which is just proportionality and liberty. So before, not you, but people who listen to this hear this and they think, yeah, but people who don't think like me, their values are wrong. And I ask you, Justin, I don't hate you because you're not 7'6" tall with red hair. And I don't hate you because you're not 4'6" tall with green hair. So why? Because that's wired into you. So it turns out, though, that actually 30 to 60% of our morals are wired into us genetically. And they know this through studies of twins. People can check the citations because this is one of the things that's always incendiary. So what it means is that you don't have to hate somebody because they have different values. You can understand that they're wired into them. And I actually think I've just come to understand that they're adaptive. Like there is a place for all of these moral tastes in the world. And so what that means is that rather than offending somebody's morals, you can just appeal to them. Because, would you serve a vegetarian veal?
Probably not. I
not,
wouldn't do
right?
that unless I was trying to be, incendiary and poking the bear. But that's, yeah,
Would you foresee somebody who keeps kosher bacon?
no,
That'd be deeply offensive, both of
yeah,
those things. So you would instead cook the vegetarian a delicious vegetarian dish. Maybe they like korma or some salad or whatever. So what that means is that when you're a free marketeer talking to a progressive, you need to frame things in progressive terms. Before people think this is completely insane or like, what do you mean exactly? Let me give you two examples. So occupational licensing is a government permission slip to work in a particular industry. You have to literally like fulfill various requirements. Otherwise, work in an industry like cutting hair is illegal and you could go to jail for it. So I want to see these burdens dramatically reduced because about 1 in 4 Americans suffers under these burdens, and it is an enormous barrier to entering industries. Like in Illinois, to cut hair, you have to do 1,500 hours. That's like 9 months of unpaid cosmetology school where you're actually paying to go there. That's wild. It's wild. Okay, so my policy objective is to reduce these unfair burdens on people, especially poor people, because it hits them the worst. Okay.
right.
So if I'm talking to somebody on the left versus somebody on the right, I'm going to frame the exact same recommendation differently. If I'm talking to somebody on the left, I'm going to say that these restrictions are, wait for it, they are inequitable. They're inequitable. And that they hurt, that's care language, they hurt the people they're meant to help. They hurt the poor and they hurt minorities. Then here comes the logic, right? So I'm generating feelings, negative feelings. Oh my God, that's inequitable. Ugh, yuck. How do we know this? Well, because data from the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis show that Blacks and Hispanics are disproportionately hurt by occupational licensing. It's a huge gap in the data. Like there's like many percentage points. So it's a big gap. So actually, by definition, it's inequitable, which means that I can authentically say that. I'm not being inauthentic. There are data to support the claim. Okay. If I'm going to talk to a conservative or libertarian about reducing occupational licensing burdens, I'm going to focus on proportionality and freedom, how people should be free to enter the professions that they want to enter, that if they work hard and they do quality work, they ought to be allowed to compete in that space. And if they do good work, then people will come. And if they don't, then they won't. And that's okay. And that's the beauty of the market. So it's the exact same recommendation, reduce restrictions. It's framed in a different way. We could rinse and repeat that with any number of policies.
No, that's exactly right. And I agree completely, obviously, with the occupational licensing one. I do think it's one of the more insane, I guess, restrictions that we have, especially for some of these like non-medical uses that are just, And Louisiana suffers, just as much as basically any state at a lot of these occupational licenses. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the moral psychology with how the moral psychology or our values differ based off of the political spectrum. And that was something that Jonathan Haidt talked about in his book, The Righteous Mind.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whenever we're
Absolutely.
thinking about trying to influence others, right? I think you bring up a great point about needing to learn where they're coming from first, so that you can then approach them in a way that means that makes the most sense for them.
Yeah.
And kind of circling back a little bit, again, we work primarily in the policy space, and I think oftentimes we can fall victim. The collective we can fall victim to being some of the worst at these communicating of ideas. So what do you see as where are we particularly bad? Kind of give us your honest consultant. Your consultant for think tanks across the world. We're particularly bad at persuasion because we like to point to numbers and graphs and charts without with ignoring sort of the persuasion, or ignoring the emotions versus the kind of rationale. Here's the facts. So what's the biggest single mistake that we make, and kind of leaning into it, what then do we do about it?
Justin, it's a great question. Where do we, I don't know if it's go wrong, it's what's missing. So what do say really smart policy folks bring to the table? They bring tremendous research. They bring such an attention to care for the data, to just making sure it's accurate, to presenting it correctly, kicking the tires on the logic. And that's tremendous virtue in that. That's hard to do. Okay. The trouble is that that's necessary, it's not sufficient. You need good logic in what you say. Say, take an engineer. Do I want illogical engineers like crafting building plans? Not really. Okay. Well, I don't want illogical policy engineers crafting things that are going to hurt people. So we do need, or that are going to have bad consequences. We do need good logic behind our policy recommendations, our sales recommendations, whatever the space is. Totally. It's just not sufficient. So when you start with logic, it's actually illogical. So you have to start with feelings, and you have to think about how what you're going to say is going to make somebody feel. And to go back to the occupational license example, if as a free marketeer, I go to a progressive and say, well, freedom, 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 hard work, they're like, that doesn't do it for me. Or if I say, what's really silly? Equity. And they're like, well, really? Because I think it's really important. Huh? Okay. It's like the vegetarian veal thing, right? So we just kind of, because we're trained to be so quote unquote logical and follow the data, we think that like logic is one thing and like it's us. And that's not true. So if you could instead understand how your audience thinks, and frame things in their terms, even though it's the same data, the same recommendation, that's a huge step. It's just really hard because it's like instant, just like aversive, painful cognitive dissonance. Wait a minute. You want me to like think like somebody who sees the world totally differently? And I think in the policy space and academics tend to think, but that's the wrong way to see things. And again, a lot of it's just wiring. It's just wiring. So the illogical thing to do is to ignore that. So what do you need to do? You need to frame things for your audience. And then we love to give long white paper presentations. Oh my God, it feels so good. The longer the better, because it's more logic. And like eventually, if you just like launch a logic tsunami that's big enough, it's gonna tip the scales, boom, win, right? Yeah. Well, no. And part of the trouble is that in addition to feeling first and then uh reasoning, before we are logic processors, we are story processors. So what a lot of folks in the policy space do is they think, well, let me just give a 30-minute white paper presentation. And if you were offered a choice between giving a 30-minute white paper presentation or offering a 30-second story, which one do you think you should do, Justin?
Well, I think I should do the 30-second one. I'd be much more inclined, like you said, to do the 30-minute
I
one.
know.
But what
And
the
okay, so
is the elevator pitch type argument.
well, okay, so let's stay in our social mobility space for a moment.
Yeah.
Raj Chetty's paper from summer of 24 with others, that showed that the single biggest driver of whether an individual experiences social mobility in their life is whether they grow up in an environment, not in a home, but in an environment where adults work. Okay, well, that's like the least wonky way I can describe the the primary takeaway from a paper that, at least for me, it was challenging to read it. It was like, "Ugh, okay, this is like it kind of hurts my head to read this thing." That's the best way I can try to describe that study in like the clearest, most persuasive terms, just like the raw data and the logic. Or shortly after that paper was released, I was talking to a colleague at a conference, and she said, I was just talking to a foster mom, and her foster kid came up to her and said, "Where do you go all day?" And do you know what the answer is, Justin?
I'm guessing work.
Work. And that was a foreign concept to that kid. He he didn't know where his foster mom went because he had never grown up in an environment where adults work. How can you possibly expect this kid to understand that dignity and independence are derived, at least in large part, not only, but in large part from work? How can you ever expect him to realize that when he's never seen adults go to work? That's about a 30-second story. I don't know. Which one do you think is more effective? The wonky explanation of the paper or the story? Where do you go all day? And even if I were presenting that study, I would start with that. And then every probably 2 or 3 minutes, I would make a refrain to where do you go all day? Because it reminds
Hmm.
them of the story. Where
Yeah.
do you go all day? Where do you go all day?
Yeah, I
When
think that's one
I
of the things
so
that us in like the policy space can do a better job at. I agree.
yeah,
Especially like I think having this sort of like approach or kind of like this cycle, I guess, would be a best maybe the best way to say this is that you have these kind of wonk white papers, academic research that does the technical things, but then you
yep,
then have to figure out you don't want the paper to just die there. You can't just print out the 50-page paper, bring it to a
yeah,
senator or a
yeah,
congressperson and say like, here you go, read this, and then you'll finally understand. So it's the tree of
yeah,
then taking that and then kind of turning it into something like a brief or an op-ed, and like finding different ways to
yeah,
communicate those ideas in a way that resonates with other people. And I mean, I'll shout us both out for a second. I think that was one thing we did very well with our co-published piece that we did
yeah,
on social mobility in Illinois, is that we
yeah,
then took the report, which was already kind of a wonky piece, into
yeah,
another report that was also kind of a wonky piece, to then these outlets that we can resonate with specific groups or people in Illinois using that research. You get the same research, right, and the same kind of rigor behind it, but the way you
yeah.
approach it and the way you speak to people about it is that's really where um, you can make that sort of difference, hopefully.
You want to be right, or do you want to make a difference? Make a
Yeah.
difference requires us to understand, accept, and navigate the cognitive realities of this thing up here, the human brain. We are story processors before we are logic processors. And stories do not only have to be about individuals. So I think one thing we did in that report together was we had this meta narrative, this meta story about like the American dream, right? And like what's at stake here. So America is an idea, and it's a story about an idea. Really encapsulated best in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's a story there about what America is, and we appeal to that. So that was one thing we did in the report. At least it's this sort of meta narrative level to, I think, make the report more persuasive than it would have been if we had not done that. So stories doesn't only have to be where do you go all day. It doesn't always have to be your individual story, Justin, about you and what you did, or about Bob or Susie. These can also be sort of like meta narratives about ideas that make people feel something. Equity, proportionality, loyalty, authority, whatever, right? They can be stories about those sorts of ideas too, because we're moral creatures.
Right. So based off of that morality and kind of the differences across the political spectrum, to really kind of circle back to this point, you open the book with a lot of data on how polarized the United States has become. And I think that's clear, right? I don't mean necessarily think that's one of those that we need polling data for. I think that's just
Sadly, no.
that's just a given. That's like it's like saying the sky is blue, right? It's just almost a
Yeah,
foregone
yeah,
fact at this point. So
yeah,
for a lot of organizations, companies, nonprofits, agencies that need to speak right to politically diverse audiences, right? So like Nike's trying to sell their shoes to not just people on the left or right. They're trying to sell shoes to everybody. So what is the practical playbook for not alienating half the room? How do you kind of circle this? How do you kind of make it work with all of these different groups going on with with a unified message, right? Because oftentimes a lot of these ads have to be, a sort of for everybody, right? The Super Bowl commercials have to be have to have wide appeal, right? Because people all over the political spectrum, all sorts of demographics watch the Super Bowl. So how do you best kind of approach that whenever you are talking to people who feel first, but from very different, kind of preconceived biases or conditions?
I mean, so it's an excellent question. If I could maybe summarize as follows, tell me if I'm wrong. How do you persuade a diverse audience?
Yeah.
It's a great question. With a lot of care and intentionality. So it's trying to understand them. And the very first chapter of the book, it's called Put Them First. And I think that the foundational rule of persuasion is that it's about them, not you. Because you're trying to persuade somebody else of something, unless you like, we've all persuaded ourselves of how brilliant and right we are. So you're trying to persuade somebody else. Okay. So what does that mean? We can dive into this more or not, but the short version is you have to put them first. It becomes more complicated though when them is different groups of people that have different values. So if you are talking to a group where, say, there are some conservatives, some libertarians, some progressives, some moderates in the room, how can you appeal to one group, pick whichever group it is, without alienating the other groups? So I think it's a couple things. First is truly understanding the audience, and then trying to avoid things that some of the groups are going to find aversive, that it's going to cause them to recoil. So then it's being for things that resonate broadly, and being for things that may say maybe one group might like and the other group might just find neutral. It's like, vanilla. It doesn't offend them, but they don't love it, and it's fine, and they don't really notice it. So like in the opportunity space that you and I both work, one word that I use especially in Illinois is empowerment. And that's a phrase that is more common on the left than right. Not exclusively, certainly, but it's a phrase that's more used on the left. So as long as I don't think that conservatives and libertarians are going to find it aversive, then I'm comfortable throwing that word in there too. Right. And that's okay. And then I talk about just
get
general
positive
concepts
feelings from
like,
one group, but like no negative feelings from others, if I'm understanding you
exactly.
correctly. Yeah.
And then 100%, I'll talk about things like dignity through work. Like, who doesn't like dignity? And like, work is a source of dignity and empowerment and independence. Okay, so dignity is a general thing. Empowerment would resonate with folks more on the left, whereas independence would resonate with folks more on the right. So I can throw all those things. So like, why is work so important? Work is a source of dignity, empowerment, and independence. Well, for the conservative, the empowerment's in that sentence going to be kind of vanilla. But for the leftist, it's going to be like, oh yeah, empowerment. Everyone's going to like dignity. And then the independence, the leftist isn't going to be like, you know what, I hate independence. That's really a terrible thing. That's just fine, whatever, right? That's good too, or that's fine. So you're trying to kind of toggle across these things to be for things that are, at least some people in the audience are going to be like, oh, that's great. That gets me going, without things that folks in the audience will find aversive too. So like if you're speaking to a diverse audience, you might, want to avoid really strong claims about like us versus them, or like radical equity or something like that, and focus more on claims that have more consensus in them, at least kind of broader things that are going to be a little bit more appealing.
Yeah, no,
While
absolutely.
staying authentic, right? You don't want to simply pander to people. So, like, I actually do think empowerment is important. So, I'm comfortable using that word. You may not feel comfortable using that word, so you shouldn't use it, because when you say it, it's not going to sound authentic.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. Like at the end of the day, one has to be true to themselves while also trying to get as
Yeah. Yeah.
appeal and persuasion as possible. So
Yeah.
one story that I liked in the book was about this law school intern who said that he went to law school because he likes winning, right?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? And we're kind of
Yeah.
circling back to the winning aspect,
Yeah.
but I mean that makes sense, right? That is actually probably a great field for someone who is hyper competitive because especially in like a courtroom setting, right? There is someone who wins the case and there's someone who loses the case, and there's very rarely room in the middle. It's usually pretty cut and dry. But you bring in an interesting perspective there to say, that this winning mindset can actually be a career liability. So why do you think sort of this aggressive pursuit of winning could be a career liability for somebody who is like overly aggressive or overly ambitious?
Because in the long term, it gives you a bad reputation and destroys trust, and it is not a long term plan for success. So take the spunky intern. It was his very first day, and hi, welcome. Tell me a little bit about you. And I said, like, look, you're in law school. You could be doing a lot of things this summer. What makes you want to spend your summer here? And he says, with this kind of tone about it, I like winning. It's like, oh, okay. And when you go into situations, I like winning, so just take law. I mean, if you take an adversarial approach to people on the other side of things, just think of how often they're going to go to court, even if they're not sure they're going to win because they don't like you. And they are not going to negotiate with you. Just imagine by contrast, if this guy were likable and he approached interactions in a shared action manner. Instead of the other lawyer saying, man, I hate this guy and I will never give an inch. If you're reasonable and likable and you listen, you demonstrate understanding and you have emotional intelligence and all that kind of stuff, you're going to grease the wheels for so many more long-term successes. So that when you call the other lawyer and they see the call ID, they're not like, oh my God, that guy. They're like, hey man, what's up? Like, okay, I know we're on other sizes, but like, what's going on here? Like, what do you really want? And then you tell them, and he's like, okay, well, we could do a good chunk of that. So instead of having everything to be, tooth and nail adversarial where I win, you lose, maybe you could just win together. And that's a lot more effective. So I think what people who have the win first and win only mindset don't understand is that not only do they leave so much value on the table because people don't like dealing with them because it's unpleasant, even if they agree with you. Because think of all the times that somebody you actually agree with, just if they wrote those things down, that you find them aversive or you find how they say something aversive, and you actually pull back from some of your own beliefs because you don't like them or you don't like how they said something. So it's like, okay. What people also don't realize that so many doors when you take this mindset never open or remain hidden. That if someone likes you, they say, hey, by the way, would you be interested in this thing? And it's like, oh, tell me more. Tell me more. So it's both the opportunities that narrow or just never come onto the table because you get that narrow opportunity just one time. You win, but then that's it. They don't want to deal with you again because you leave a bad taste in their mouth.
Right. So that it also leads to potentially a different avenue that I'm thinking about just now is, if you are that type of adversarial type who is just very aggressive and just needs to win so badly, that's actually great motivation for the other person to kind of combat you with more adversary and also trying to win. Like, I'm a pretty, mellow person, but if someone, is, kind of puts that sort of, direct attack or kind of backs you into a corner,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
You're either going to want to leave the situation, which is kind of getting to where you were going, which is, the kind of freeze or flight mode where you just want to leave the situation and avoid them to begin with, or the fight mode where they come back and now have extra motivation to, kind of have these kind of punches, tit for tat in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that's very interesting. That's something I hadn't thought about until you were kind of giving your answer. And that goes back to, like, again, the traditional like fight or flight or freeze mode that people get into. Well, if you back someone in a corner, eventually they're going to come back and fight at some point. And, if you are the ones backing them into that corner, that's going to make you even harder to approach and harder to actually get what you want, and actually can lead to, even in the short term, some potential negative consequences. So I have one final potential meta question for you.
Yeah.
So when I was reading the book, I think the people who most need to read the book like this, whether that's ideological advocates, bad faith communicators, entrenched politicians, not to group them all together, but those are the groups that I would say, probably aren't. I think they're different for various reasons, but
Yeah.
they're the people who probably need to read the book to begin with, or the former law school intern, or someone who is overly aggressive. They're probably also the least likely to actually pick it up because they probably preconceive to have their own views
Yeah.
sort of work
Yeah.
out, and they're like, oh, this is how I approach things, and this kind of fight strategy works for me, and that's how I get things done. So how do you
Yeah.
persuade people to change how they persuade by buying the book, or looking at the book in the first place, when they're the ones who actually need it the most?
Yeah. I mean, it was ironic. Just exactly what you're talking about. A former intern, super, super smart kid. Super smart kid. Like unquestionably, like notably smarter than I am. I'm not saying I'm smart, just like this guy's like definitely smarter than me. Super sharp, like one of the smartest kids I've ever encountered, period. Having taught at some really great schools and having met and worked with kids from lots of great schools. He's like one of the smartest kids I've ever met. And I said, "Well, would you buy my book?" And he said, that kind of book, it's not for me." But the trouble is that he is one of these like hyper logical people where it's like, boom, analytical, and let me show you what's up. And if you don't see things this is wrong, and I will grind you down until you see how wrong you are. And I know for a fact that this has held this person back as he's grown in his career. I know for a fact 'cause people have actually told me that. So it's like, huh. He's exactly the kind of person who needs the book most because he's super smart and he approaches everything logic first, logic last, logic only. So, what would I say to someone who celebrates the logic only approach? I mean, a couple of things. So, I try to frame these things in a way that's like, okay, so we've kind of hit on some of the framings here. Do you want to be right or do you want to make a difference? And first, like, yeah, to be right. It's like, well, wait a minute, but being right and making a difference, they're different things. Yeah. Okay, so let's explore how that is. We talked about that today. And I asked them, um, if I went against you, what does that make you? We talked about this, a loser. It's like, huh, okay, wait a minute. But I thought persuasion was about winning. And so, well, okay, is it about convincing? No, because it's conquest and then that's barbaric. Huh, okay. Well, I don't like that. Okay. When I do workshops on this, when I talk about the like logic first approach, I show a picture of someone driving a stake in a vampire star. And it's like, okay, well, is that how somebody changes your mind? No, not exactly. Um, so it's like these framings are meant to, even in these logic only people, sort of like just have them pause for a second and reflect. Wait a minute, maybe there's something missing here. Maybe there's something missing here. And then I say, look, I mean, just think. And it's also where I'll say, look, the logic first approach is illogical. That's what all the neuroscience and all the psychology say. I'm super lucky to have Peter Salovey as one of the endorsers of my book, and he is one of the founders of emotional intelligence as a field, former president of Yale University, and professor there of psychology. I mean, he is one of the leading figures just in psychology in general, and definitely in emotional intelligence. And he endorsed my book, and it's like, wow, my God, honored. So it's like, no, like this is what the psychology says. This is what the neuroscience says. So is it illogical to just reject cognitive reality? No, it's not. If none of those things work, then probably this person isn't in a situation in their life where they're ready to receive this. I would also ask them maybe to reflect on some examples where they felt like they were so right and they didn't get what they wanted. So make it personal and then say, well, what do you think happened there? And if they say, well, it's just this person wouldn't open their eyes. Okay, maybe. But sometimes they'll be reflective. They'll say, well, maybe I was a little bit too aggressive. Okay, well, say more. Because, I mean, the worst thing you can do is come to somebody and, again, beat them over the head with my logic of how to get what you want and say, man, aren't you just like obnoxiously aggressive? That's like the exact opposite of what would be helpful. So it's getting them to reflect on moments when they see, maybe that was suboptimal.
Mhm.
Maybe this is not the right way to approach things. Okay. It has to be phenomenological at some level. It has to be based on somebody's lived experience. I can't live an experience for them. And until they experience a time that was important, that they didn't get what they wanted because their logic only approach cost them, until they experience and recognize that, they are probably not going to embrace I think, much more holistic approach to persuasion, which is what I offer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great sales pitch. So we did kind of like you said, the kind of 30-minute, 60-minute white paper this episode. So let's give you the 30 seconds of, the elevator pitch, or the, kind of very succinct pitch. What are you hoping people who read the book come away from it with?
The difference between having a great idea and having others embrace it is persuasion. Persuasion is simple. It's not easy. It's simple because if you learn how to navigate the cognitive realities of the human brain, which is what I teach you in the book, your chances of getting what you want repeatedly skyrocket.
Thanks to Josh Bandoch for a great conversation with the From Ideas to Innovation podcast, where we bring together innovators, academics, and policymakers. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please drop a comment below, check out our show notes on Substack, and please like and subscribe to this podcast.